Hidden talents. Cheater on the phone after lunch. Cheater. Hi, I can't talk long. Class starts in a minute. I just wanted to say hello. Mrs. Wu. Are you studying hard? Cheater. Yes, Mom. Mrs. Wu. Your father and I will pick you up this weekend. Cheater. Great. Hey, guess what? I met a new kid. Mrs. Who. Is he a nice boy? Cheater. Yeah, well, sort of. I think he's okay. He likes to kid me, but he's not mean. At least not too mean. He seems pretty smart too. Not as smart as I am, of course, but he isn't a dummy. Mrs. Wu. Well, just be careful who you associate with. Cheater. I will. Mrs. Wu. How are you doing with your test? Cheater. I have to go. I need to get a good spot for science. Bye. Mr. Briggs was waiting for us when we walked into science class. Today he was wearing a Harvard sweatshirt with his jeans. Hey, a new face, he said. Come on in. Welcome. Glad to have you. He smiled and it almost looked like he meant it. Torchy had already plunked down on the carpet next to Cheater. He took a piece of paper from his notebook and put it on the rug. I guess it was an assignment from last week. I was about to sit next to Torchy when I noticed the paper was on fire. I guess Mr. Briggs noticed too. He walked over and calmly stomped the paper, smothering the flame. Then he felt out his hand. Come on, give me the matches. Torchy shook his head. I don't have no matches. He reached into his giant jeans and pulled his pockets inside out. A bunch of change went flying on the floor, along with half a dozen lighters. Mr. Briggs bent over and scooped up the lighters. Philip, if you keep denying that you have a problem, you'll never make any progress. But I don't have a problem, Torchy said as he gathered his coins. Mr. Briggs shook his head, then said, I'm not going to force you to face reality. Only you can make that decision. But you might want to think about the evidence. He walked to the front of the room and started the lesson. Torchy was right. Mr. Briggs was a pretty good teacher, and he didn't get in my face with all the new kid garbage. But learning stuff or not learning stuff was never my problem. I didn't have any trouble with science or math or English. I just had trouble keeping my mouth shut sometimes. It wasn't really fair. Lots of other kids mouthed off, but I always seemed to get in the most trouble for it. My sister mouthed off sometimes, but she didn't get in trouble. Maybe it was because she was a girl. Mom always stood up for her, and Dad never got mad at her. But I didn't hold it against her. She was the only one in the family who didn't treat me like some kind of giant disappointment. So science class was fine. Mr. Briggs pulled equipment out of the closet while we talked. I noticed that there wasn't a whole lot of stuff, just a couple of microscopes, some test tubes, and a small pile of assorted junk. He showed us several experiments we could do with ropes and pulleys, then let us play around on our own. The time went pretty quickly, except for one of the runts who had the misfortune to experience 30 seconds of pure terror. I think his name was Squibbly, or something like that. Bloodbath wrapped a rope around Squibbly's throat and kind of lifted him up in the air. But he let go before Mr. Briggs noticed. I realized that Bloodbath was sort of like a human version of a stealth bomber. He could slip in, cause pain, and slip away without detection. As I was leaving at the end of the class, Mr. Briggs called me over to the desk. Martin, could I talk with you for a minute? Sure, I had no idea what he wanted, but he was a teacher, so he had the power to talk with me until my ears bled, if that's what made him happy. I've been looking over your records, and I'm a bit confused. Most of the students are here because they've had extremely serious problems in other schools. The entries in your file aren't very specific. He stopped talking and watched me. I knew that trick. He was waiting for me to start talking. The really good interviewers on TV do the same thing. They ask a question, then they just stop talking and wait. Even after they get an answer, they wait for more. Most people can't stand silence, so they blab all their secrets away. I really wasn't in the mood to spill my life story, so I just smiled and shrugged. Sure enough, he couldn't stand the silence either. Well, I just wanted you to know that I'm here if you ever have any problems, okay? Okie dokie, I said. Can I go now? Yes, but remember, I'm here to help you. He leaned forward and gave me a warm smile. I took a step away. Actually, I'll bet you're here because you couldn't get a job at some big fancy college or some important chemical company. I walked off. Halfway across the room, I started to feel like a real rat. Mr. Briggs had been nice to me, and the way I've acted, I might as well just have kicked him in the crotch. I turned around so I could say I was sorry, but he was staring out the window like his mind was a million miles away. I sprinted down the hall and caught up with Torchy, who was just catching up with Cheater. I wondered why Cheater hadn't rushed ahead for seats. Then I noticed Bloodbath strolling along farther up the hall. I guess Cheater didn't want to risk running past him. He hits me every time I get near him, Cheater said, following my gaze down the hall. I'm not surprised. I'd suspected Bloodbath might have a couple of favorite punching bags. What did Briggs want? Torchy asked. He wanted to let me know that I'm not really such a bad person. It was quite a relief to hear that. Guess I can pack up my things and go home now. Really? Cheater asked. That's great. He grinned, then his smile faded. But you just got here. How come you get to leave? It's not fair. I shook my head. This kid was amazing. He'd believe anything. He was just too easy. Wait, I get it, Cheater said. You were kidding. Can't fool you, I told him. I looked at my schedule. History's next. What's it like? Torchy grinned. Cheater grinned. What? I asked. You'll see, Torchy said. New student preliminary evaluation form. Student name, Martin Anderson. Evaluation. To be honest, I'd like to shake him up, but maybe that's my problem, not his. I sense there's something good inside him. Not deep inside and hidden where nobody will ever find it, just inside somewhere. I'd rather not be too hasty to judge him. Evaluator, Dale Briggs. Let's just say Miss Crenshaw is big on class participation, Cheater told me. I found out what he meant the moment I walked into the room. The teacher was right inside the doorway handing out costumes. Hi, you must be the new boy, she said, shoving a white and fluffy bundle into my hands. This is a voluntary class. Anyone who doesn't want to attend can choose to go to a traditional lecture with Mr. Ludovicio across the hall. I looked at my lump of fluff. It was a white wig. All I could manage to say was, huh? You get to be Thomas Jefferson today, Miss Crenshaw said, smiling like she just told me I'd won the lottery. She handed another wig to Torchy. You're George Washington, she said. A puff of powder drifted between his hands. Then Miss Crenshaw thrust a folded piece of cloth toward Flinch, who grimaced and pulled away at first, but finally took it from her. Not Martha again, Flinch said, letting the dress flop open between his fists. Please, I hate being Martha. I was Martha twice last week. Can't I be Ben Franklin? Mrs. Crenshaw just smiled and said, Now that's not a helpful attitude. Every role is important. There are no small parts. I'm sure you don't want to let the others down, do you? Flinch looked around. Hey, would any of you feel let down if I didn't play Martha Washington? This poor kid. Once we saw how much he didn't want to play the part, there was no way we were going to help him get out of it. We're counting on you, Martha, Cheater said. Lucky, who had just walked in, said, Every country needs a mother. It's your duty, Flinch. Others joined in. Flinch never had a chance. A kid might help another kid who fell into a river, and a kid might help another kid search for a lost baseball. But there isn't a kid I've met who will help another kid out of humiliating situation. We just aren't built that way. So I put on the wig and tried to act like Thomas Jefferson. Not that I had a clue how to really do that. It was pretty much a wasted hour. We all walked around and talked about the revolution. I'm pretty sure I didn't learn anything except that wigs are uncomfortable. I noticed that the tough kids who'd been in my other classes weren't in history. Miss Crenshaw had said that there was a choice. I guess the thugs had decided they didn't want to wear costumes and wigs. As far as I was concerned, that was one good reason to stick with this class, no matter how crazy it seemed. All we had to do was walk around and make sure we used the vocabulary words the teacher had put on the blackboard. No trouble at all. Toward the end of the period, Miss Crenshaw asked us to sit down so we could discuss what we'd learned. I was just relaxing in my chair when someone shouted at me, Shut up! Just shut up! I looked over to my right. It was Lucky. He was glaring at me. But it was real spooky. I would have bet $1,000 that even though his eyes were pointed in my direction, he didn't see me. A hand tapped my shoulder. Don't worry about it, Torchy said. He does it sometimes. Nobody else seemed worried about it. I turned away from Lucky. Sure enough, a minute later, when I glanced back, he seemed okay. At the end of the period, as I was handing in my wig, Miss Crenshaw patted me on the arm and said, Well, Martin, did you enjoy our little class? All I had to do was nod and say yes. That would have been fine. 3 letters, 1 syllable, and I'd be out of there. Instead, I said, You must really have a desperate desire to be in the theater. I shook my head. This sure ain't Broadway, but it's as close as you'll ever get. She looked like she wanted to hit me. Through gritted teeth, she said, You don't have to participate. You can attend the lecture instead. Would you like to do that? I shook my head. No, thanks. She continued to glare at me. It seemed I've gotten another teacher to leave my fan club. That wasn't fair. I hadn't really said anything all that bad. At this rate, I'd need to start using pencil and paper to keep track of who hated me. Though with my luck, Torchy would set up my list on fire. Does Lucky do that a lot? I asked Torchy when we left the room. Torchy shrugged. Not that much. You'll get used to it. He's really a good guy. Just make sure you don't make any comments about things that being missing when he's around. He's really sensitive about because he's always getting in trouble for stealing stuff. I'll keep that in mind. I glanced back into the room. Lucky was in the corner, reaching into the wastebasket. I couldn't tell whether he was putting something in or taking something out. I guess it didn't matter either way. Anyone ever get out of here? I asked Torchy as we walked down the hall. Kids drop out when they get old enough, he said, or they get arrested and go to jail. That only happened a couple of times when there was real bad fights. Principal Davis doesn't like to call the cops. You can graduate, of course, but that's no good because then you have to go to the alternative high school down in Danville, and that place is 10 times worse than here. No, I mean, does anyone ever get back to regular school? There's the review, Torchy said. What review? I asked. Didn't you read your handbook? I thought about the charred paper in my wastebasket. I guess I couldn't blame Torchy. Even if he hadn't set it on fire, I've already tossed the handbook out. Tell me about it. Well, they get together at the end of your first month and discuss whether you should stay. After that, you're here for good. They? I asked. Your teachers, Torchy said. The ones you see in class. It's not really fair. There were 4 fires the day I had my review. They blamed me. For all 4. Can you believe that? I heard it was the quickest review in the history of school. I was only half listening to Torchy. My mind was replaying my first meeting with each of my teachers. So far, I'd pretty much guaranteed they'd hate me. 1 month. Maybe if I just kept my mouth shut and did my work, I'd have a chance. There was only one class left for the day. I promised myself no matter what, I wouldn't make another teacher angry. It turned out to be a difficult promise to try to keep. New student preliminary evaluation form. Student name, Martin Anderson. Evaluation. I love them all, of course. They need me. But this one might be an exception. Evaluator, Priscilla Nomad. I guess every teacher has his own idea of how to teach a class at Edgeview. Mr. Briggs obviously belonged to the crowd that thought a teacher should be a buddy and a pal. Miss Crenshaw was really into getting the class involved. Mr. Parsons was one of those teachers who experimented with all sorts of methods. Miss Nomad seemed to think a smile and a cheerful attitude would work wonders. Mr. Langhorne, the geography teacher, had a more traditional approach. Mr. Langhorne depended on discipline from start to finish. Strict discipline. As he stomped into the room, I sensed a change in everyone's mood. They had that pathetic look that a dog gets when it expects a whack on the snout with a rolled up newspaper. Mr. Langhorne stood at his desk and glared at us for a moment. He wore his hair in a crew cut and it almost looked like he ironed his suit. I had the feeling he spent a good chunk of each day polishing his shoes. Even though everyone was reasonably quiet, Mr. Langhorne began class by shouting, "Quiet! No more talking!" His voice was hoarse, like it had suffered from a lifetime of yelling. Little bits of spit sprayed from his mouth. I was happy the seats Cheater had grabbed for us weren't in the front row. Being close to Mr. Langhorne for a whole class would probably be a lot like taking a warm shower. For the next hour, he filled us with geography facts. Anytime anybody fidgeted a little or whispered, Mr. Langhorne shouted. I remembered him yelling, shouting, ranting, raving, and snarling. I remembered him panting at kids and demanding silence. I remembered him calling us all sorts of names, but I didn't remember a single fact that he told us about geography. Not one ocean or river or capital. I knew he talked about geography. When he wasn't yelling, he was teaching us about some country. I think it was in South America, but as hard as I tried at the end of the period, I couldn't recall a single fact that he mentioned. That wouldn't have been a big problem, except that as the class was ending, Mr. Langhorne strutted from desk to desk, firing questions at us. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd failed to absorb the lesson. Nobody came up with answers. This definitely didn't please him. By the time he got to me, he was not a happy teacher. "You!" he snapped, bending over until his face was just inches from mine. He smelled like stale tobacco and sugar-free gum. "Tell me one thing you've learned today." I looked around the room, hoping for a clue. The walls were lined with travel posters. There were beautiful pictures of exotic places: Portugal, Singapore, New Guinea. "Are you an idiot?" Mr. Langhorne asked. He grabbed my jaw and yanked my head back toward him. "Don't look around the room. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Did I just waste my time? Can't you give me one simple fact?" He let his hand drop from my face. Here's a fact, I yelled. You've never been to any of these places. You just talk about them. It was a shot in the dark. I mean, most people don't get to travel a lot. I never been anywhere. But for all I know, maybe Mr. Langhorne had flown all over the world. But it was like Torchy's pictures of Mars. You don't fill a room with posters of places you've been. You fill it with dreams. Still, as the words I'd shouted echoed in my mind, I figured it wasn't something that would get me in much trouble. Wrong again. Mr. Langhorne got redder. He leaned closer and grabbed the edge of my desk. I expected him to pick up the desk and break it across his knees. Apparently, I'd hit on the truth, and it didn't make him happy. He stared at me for another minute. The bell rang. He stood up and backed away. Class dismissed, he snarled. I got up slowly. I still expected him to hit me or twist my head off, but I got out through the doorway in one piece. Martin, wait up! I turned toward Mr. Briggs. He was jogging down the hallway. See you upstairs, Torchy said. He headed off. Cheater went the other way, down the hall. I guess he was going to the library. Yeah? I asked Mr. Briggs when he reached me. What you said before, maybe part of that is true. He shrugged. Maybe it's all true, but what I said was true too. I'm here for you if you need someone to talk to, okay? Sure, I backed up a step. Just because he understood physics and chemistry doesn't mean he had any chance of understanding me. Is that all? That's all. I made my escape and headed off toward the stairs. One thing at Edgeview was no different from any other school I'd been to. I had homework. Not a lot, but I had some math problems to do and some reading for English. From what I'd seen, at least half the kids didn't bother doing their homework, but I figured it would help kill some time. I decided to go back to the room and get started on it. As I reached the top of the stairs, a door down the hall flew open with a bang. Nobody came out of the room. I glanced inside as I passed the open doorway. That kid Trash, the one I'd asked about in the cafeteria, was in the room, sitting at a desk, hunched over with a pencil in his hand. Just after I turned my eyes away, I heard this fluttering whoosh, followed by a bang that made me duck and cover my head. Something had slammed into the wall right behind me, hitting hard enough to knock out a piece of plaster. I spun and looked down at the math book lying on the floor. Talk about a deadly weapon. I picked it up and stared back into the room. Okay, I'd taken enough crap for one day. More than enough. I walked in. The kid glanced up, watching me with empty eyes. You trying to hit me? I asked. If you were, you'd better practice. Your aim sucks. I held out the book, ready to jump back if he took a swing at me. He was about my size, hard to tell for sure since he was sitting, maybe a couple inches taller and a few pounds heavier, but close enough, so I figured I could take him if I had to. I wasn't trying to hit you. He reached up, took the book from me, and tossed it on the bed. I noticed there was just one bed in the room. Torchy had told me that some of the rooms were so small they didn't try to cram two people inside. I relaxed a bit and glanced around the room. Whoa, it looked like the inside of a rock tumbler. The window was boarded over with a sheet of plywood. There were chips of plaster missing from spots on all four walls. Most of the books in the room were piled in one corner. Tangled clothing covered the floor of the closet. The closet door was smashed through in a couple of spots and hanging from one hinge. You must be Trash, I said. I must be. I'm Martin, I said, holding out my hand. Nice to meet you. We shook hands. His grip was a lot stronger than I expected. I took a step back. Well, I've got homework. Better get to it. Okay, he turned back to his sketch pad. I looked over his shoulder. It started out as a quick glance, but what I saw locked me in place. He was drawing this incredible scene of a rocket shooting across an alien landscape. I watched him for a few minutes, but he didn't look back up, so I went out the door and down the hall in my room. As I got closer to the room, I heard voices from inside. It sounded like Torchy and Lucky. Torchy was saying, "We can trust him." Maybe, Lucky said, but I don't want to take any chances, so let's not rush. Okay, Torchy said. I waited to see if they would say anything else about me, but they didn't. After a while, I felt funny standing out there listening, so I rattled the knob to make sure they heard me coming and then went in. Hi, Torchy said a little too quickly. Hi. I sat at my desk and got started on my homework while Torchy and Lucky found another topic of conversation. It was okay if they had a secret. I was new, and it would take a while before they trusted me. I was pretty sure the secret had something to do with Friday nights because they almost let something slip about that already. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Principal Davis stuck his head in and said to Torchy, "Come with me, please, Philip." Torchy sighed as he went past and muttered, "Didn't do nothing." He followed the principal out of the hallway. What do you think will happen to him? I asked Lucky. He shrugged. No way to guess. He stared at me. I was afraid he was going to start shouting again. Instead, he quietly said, I look out for my friends. Understand? Torchy, he's my friend. Same with Cheater and Flinch. They're my friends. You treat them okay, we'll get along. I nodded. No problem. He stood up. See you later. Bye. About an hour later, Torchy came back. He smelled like smoke. Well, he always smelled like smoke, but right now it was stronger than ever. What happened? I asked. They made me light fires. Can you believe that? For a whole hour, they just kept making me burn pieces of paper. He held up his right thumb. Look, I got a blister from the lighter. They made you light fires? He nodded. Guess they figured if they made me do it, I'd get tired of it. But I didn't do nothing in the first place. I didn't say anything. Obviously, he wanted to keep pretending that he didn't have a problem. As I finished my homework, Lucky came back. I realized that our room was the place where everyone hung out. Maybe it was because we were at the end of the hall. Maybe it was because Torchy had a lot of magazines. Lucky had brought his portable stereo. It's mine, he said when he caught me looking at it. I didn't steal it. I got it last Christmas. Hey, I didn't say anything, I told him. Cheater came next. Flinch dropped by soon after that. It wasn't like a party or anything, it was just a bunch of us sitting around talking or reading or just listening to music. Maybe it was a safety thing. Together, we were less likely to be harmed by a bloodbath. Maybe it was a social thing. We had the common bond of being sent to Edgeview. I really didn't feel like trying to explain it right then. Does Trash ever drop in? I asked Torchy after the other kids had left. Him? No way. We tried hanging out with him. All of us did, especially me. I really tried hard to make friends with him, but he's not a lot of fun to have around. He's always throwing stuff. That kind of makes the rest of us nervous. I can't see how it might. Torchy shook his head. He even threw a sneaker at Bloodbath once in the locker room. Can you believe it? He got the crap kicked out of him for that. I didn't want to hear any more about Bloodbath. Hey, got anything to read besides magazines? Torchy pointed to the closet. I have tons of books in there. Help yourself. Thanks. I opened the closet and dug through his collection. There was a lot of good stuff. He has some Jack London and Jules Verne, and I'd already read most of that. My sister had gotten me started on them, along with H.G. Wells, Robert Heinlein, and Roald Dahl. I discovered Dean Koontz and Stephen King on my own. I searched around and finally picked a battered and slightly charred paperback called 50 Great Science Fiction Stories. Maybe it was the first book that gave me my first real hint. The stories I read described all kinds of strange and wonderful things. I guess they gave my mind a shove in a direction I hadn't planned. At one point, I glanced up from the book and looked at the clock on Torchy's desk. A whole day, I said. What? Torchy said. I've been here a whole day. Happy anniversary, Torchy said. Thanks. I thought about the first day. It couldn't be called a success. I got nearly every teacher angry with me. I was used to that sort of reaction, but even I was surprised at how quickly I've gotten into trouble. Still, I didn't think it was fair to compare me with kids who set fires or stole or threw stuff or cheated all the time. Fair. Now, there was a fun word. Dad liked to remind me that life wasn't fair. I'd heard that from him more than once. And then he'd tell me all the things I should be thankful for. And then he'd tell me how easy my life was compared to when he was a kid. And I'd tell myself if I couldn't wait to get away. Well, here I was, away, for real. I'd never been away from my parents like this before, not in a place I couldn't leave. I was on my own. There were teachers all over the school. Edgeview had no shortage of adults, but that didn't change the fact that I was on my own. None of the adults here had any reason to care about what happened to me. None of the teachers were going to worry about the fate of one more face in the crowd, no matter what they might say about wanting to help. They especially after wouldn't care after the way things had gone today. As I heard the dinner bell ring, I put down the book of science fiction stories and got to my feet. Pretty strange, I said to Torchy. Yeah, it's got some cool stories, he said. I didn't bother to tell him I hadn't been talking about the book. Memo from Principal Davis to all staff. Subject state inspection. With our inspection just 5 months away, we need to begin preparations. I expect us all to pitch in and work together. Please be prepared to discuss this in detail at the next staff meeting. As you are all aware, the state had had some pressure from town residents who aren't in favor of our school. Fortunately, Mayor Walden is still on our side. This is a letter. Hey, Marty. So, how's your vacation so far? Is it as much fun as the week we went to Williamsburg? Mom and Dad miss you, even though you just left. I can tell. Well, okay, Mom misses you. Who knows what Dad's thinking? He's been stomping around all week with with that angry look. You know, where he's mad but you don't have a clue why. But I sure miss you, especially at bedtime. I still say goodnight, you creepy little twerp, but nobody answers back. I wish you'd get your act together. It feels awfully empty around here. Are you using that charming personality of yours to make any friends? Your wonderful sister, Terry. Part 2, Seeing the Truth. If my arrival at Edgeview reminded me of a prison movie, the start of my day reminded me of endless television reruns. My second day was distressingly like my first. I went to classes, got in trouble, and went to more classes. My second week was also pretty much like my first. In other words, I'd settled into a routine, which wasn't at all that easy since things in the classroom had a way of changing. We actually played a board game in math for a couple of days until someone stole the dice. Mr. Langhorn tried different stuff in geography too, but no matter what we did, he always yelled. Even in history, we didn't wear costumes every day. Thank goodness. I was getting sick of the smell of talcum powder. Sometimes we had a lecture or a test. Miss Nomad couldn't seem to stick with one approach for more than a couple of English classes. We did worksheets for 2 days in a row. Then we memorized stuff for 3 days. That was awful. I know a preposition when I see one. I sure don't have to memorize a list of them. Then we sat and read. That was better. Then we sat and wrote, which was okay too. Despite what I said to Miss Nomad, I did kind of like to write, except when we had to do stuff about ourselves. One day, she made us write an essay called Why I Like Being Me. Give me a break. But whatever we did in class, I could usually expect to be doing something else a couple days later. So the main thing that never changed about classes was that things always changed. Most of the time, my teachers just ignored me. That was fine. If they didn't talk to me, I didn't talk back. I figured that if I stayed as invisible as possible, they just might forget about the first day and vote to send me back to regular school when the time came for my review. I didn't I even did all my homework, though once in a while Torchy burned it before I could hand it in. There was just one problem. The teachers didn't always cooperate with my plan. Sometimes they slip up and ask me a stupid question, and I'd say something that would make them angry. But mostly they were learning to leave me alone. As for my social life, it took almost 3 weeks, and one foolish moment on my part before Torchy and the others shared their secret. I knew something was going on. A person would have to be as dumb as dirt not to notice all the winks, whispers, and meaningful glances they exchanged every Friday. They sure weren't playing checkers. The first Friday night after I arrived, Torchy slipped out of the room around 8. He mumbled something about going to the bathroom. He was gone for hours. If he'd spend all that time in the bathroom, there'd be nothing left of him. Torchy snuck back in around midnight, moving with all the silent grace of a moose on a floor full of marbles. I was half asleep, but I glanced at the glowing hands of his desk clock when I heard him tiptoe in from the hallway. He repeated the scene a week later. The clumps of snow clinging to the sides of his shoe made it obvious he'd been outside. I didn't worry about it. I figured they'd tell me sooner or later, and if they didn't, it was no big deal. I spent more time thinking about the larger puzzle that was tickling against the back of my mind. I saw a painting once that showed a couple of guys climbing a hill. At first, there was nothing special about it, but if you stepped back and let your eyes relax, the whole scene turned into a picture of a grinning skull. I felt Edgeview was like that. Whatever I saw right now, it wasn't the whole picture. I needed to step back and let my eyes drift, but I wasn't sure how to do that. At the moment, all I could do was keep my eyes open and wait for things to fall into place. But at least I got along with my roommate and his friends, and they treated me okay. The guys even tried to give me a nickname. Flinch said they would call me Squirt because I really had a knack for making teachers mad. Fortunately, the name didn't stick. As smart as Cheater was, Flinch was brilliant in his own way. He didn't have a million facts in his head, but he could think up stuff really fast. Flinch saw connections. Smart or not, he got in as much trouble as the rest of us. Not only was he pretty distracted most of the time, he was as jumpy as a cat in a room full of pit bulls, and he also interrupted the teachers a lot. They tended not to appreciate that. As for Friday nights and the big secret, I don't know how long, if ever, it would have taken before they told me. But on Wednesday of the third week, I was walking down the hall when I heard the unmistakable sound of Cheater yelping in pain. I spun back and saw Bloodbath had just tossed Cheater against the wall. Watch where you're going next time, Bloodbath said. He grabbed Cheater with one hand and raised the other fist. Oh boy, I knew this routine. No matter what Cheater did or said, Bloodbath would pound him in for a while. I scanned the halls for the one thing that might have saved Cheater. No luck. There wasn't a teacher in sight. But Bloodbath didn't know that. Trying not to think about how stupid it was to approach Bloodbath, I ran over and pointed back to the door of the nearest classroom. Langhorn and Davis are coming out, I said, trying to fill my voice with panic. It wasn't hard. Bloodbath flashed a smile at me, then he punched me on the shoulder. I guess that was his way of saying thanks, and slunk away in the opposite direction. Thanks, Cheater said. Anytime. I guess Cheater told Lucky what happened because at the end of the third week on Friday evening, as soon as we'd gone upstairs after dinner, Torchy let me in on the secret. Friday nights, he said, looking nervously around our room as if the walls and ceilings were filled with hidden microphones, we do something special. Oh, really? I asked, trying to sound surprised. He nodded. Yeah, there's no way anyone would know. That's because we're real careful. We never tell anybody. But we talked about it and everyone thinks you're okay. What we do is sneak off into town. Want to come? Absolutely. My pulse sped at the possibility of getting outside of Edgeview. Even a few hours would be wonderful. We were allowed into the schoolyard, but that was as far as we could go. It almost seemed as if they were afraid to let us be seen in town. They never let us leave the school unless our folks came for us on the weekend. Mine hadn't. I was getting ready to climb the walls. Where do you go? Torchy shrugged. Usually the arcade, sometimes we just hang out. Sounds fine to me. Maybe I could even get a slice of pizza or some other real food. The very thought was enough to make me drool. So that evening, I learned the story of Lucky's great escape route. Philip Grieg. This is a poem written by Torchy. I like being me because I'm friendly. I get along with everyone. Well, almost everyone who doesn't hit people, if you know what I mean. I have lots of friends. Sometimes I lose friends because their stuff gets burned up and they blame me, even if it's not my fault. I never done nothing, ever done nothing they did I see. But even so, I have lots of friends, which is good. And that's the biggest reason why I like being me. Torchy whispered the whole story to me in our room. Lucky was fooling around behind the school last October, bouncing a tennis ball against the back wall. Anyhow, one time the ball got past him. When he was looking for it, he noticed this round place in the ground. He's always finding stuff. Anyhow, he decided to check it out. He got a stick and started poking around. Guess what he found? I shrugged. Not a clue. There was this manhole cover. He called me over and we got it up. Guess what we found? I just shrugged again. A pipe, Torchy said. This big old tunnel. I guess it was a drain or something. We followed it. I didn't really want to go, but I wasn't going to be chicken if Lucky went. It doesn't go far, but get this, it comes out on the other side of the fence down at the bottom of the hill. He paused, I guess to let me fully appreciate the meaning of that. It was the perfect way out. Since the fence was 10 feet high and back, nobody ever checked to see if kids were there. They locked the front gate in the evening when the guard left. Which door do we use? I asked. Torchy shook his head. Too dangerous. We could get caught. Lucky's room is in the back, so we go out his window. I thought Lucky had a room on this floor, I said. Torchy nodded. He does, but we made a ladder, Torchy said. Lucky found some broomsticks in a closet, and we borrowed a bunch of rope from Mr. Briggs' supplies. I tied the knots myself. I was a Cub Scout. I could have been a Boy Scout too, but I got kicked out because of this fire in my tent. Man, canvas really burns a lot faster than you think, but that's not important. He stood up and said, Come on, let's get ready. Torchy showed me how to stuff clothes under my blankets to make it look like I was asleep in bed. That was just in case anyone checked the rooms. It probably wasn't necessary. Once classes were over, nobody seemed to care all that much what we did, as long as it didn't involve too much violence or vandalism. The teachers went home in the evening, except whoever had gotten stuck with night duty, which just meant sleeping in that room on the second floor in case there was an emergency. One more thing, Torchy whispered as we cracked open our door. Remember, don't ever mention stealing to Lucky, okay? Sure, no problem. I followed Torchy down the hall to meet Lucky. True to his name, he had the room to himself. The rope ladder was already dangling out the window. A long stick tied to the top kept it from falling through. From the sharp chill in the room, it felt like the window had been open for a while. I watched as the others climbed down one at a time. When my turn came, I wasn't sure I could do it. I got my left leg out of the window fine, but it took 3 tries before I managed to swing the other leg past the ledge. The ladder swayed like a funhouse floor, and I had to dig with my toes to get each rung away from the wall. Halfway down, my hand started to grow numb from the cold. I hurried to reach the ground before I lost my grip. Despite visions of splattering myself into a huge pile of roadkill, I made it without any slips. What if we get caught? I asked after I stepped away from the ladder. Lucky shrugged. What can they do? Shoot us? I saw his point. We were already at the end of the line as far as getting in trouble. It's a good thing I wasn't afraid of the dark. Torchy had forgotten the flashlight, and nobody felt like going back for it. We walked in total blackness through the pipe. It was a darkness so complete it made me feel I no longer existed except as a bundle of thoughts. Even though I wasn't scared, I didn't like the experience. It's weird what visions the minds can create with the eye when the eyes can't see, but I got through it. The pipe spilled us out on the side of a wooded hill about 50 yards from the road. We followed the road into town and headed for the arcade. The thought of video games made me realize I had a problem. I don't have any money, I told them. No big deal, Lucky said. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a handful of quarters. I hesitated. It felt funny taking money from him. Go ahead, help yourself. I didn't steal it. He shook his head, jangling the coins in his palm. I never said you did. It's just that I don't know when I can pay you back. I figured I could ask my folks for some money, but they probably wouldn't send me any. Don't worry about it, Lucky said. It's my treat. You want it or not? Thanks. I took the coins from him and put them in my pocket. The town of Edgeview wasn't very big. Actually, the main part was across the interstate. The side we could reach was only about 7 blocks from the school. But traveling through town felt like walking into a world of houses, homes, and families. It didn't take long to figure out that I was marked. Groups of kids standing and horsing around in the streets got quiet when we went past. Some of them crossed the streets when we came near. A couple little kids even ran away from us. What's going on? I asked Torchy. Huh? He looked around as if he didn't know what I meant. Maybe he was used to seeing kids flee from him. They're scared of us, Cheater said, grinning. Can you believe that? They think everyone from Edgeview is dangerous. Do I look like a killer? I squinted at him. Hard to tell in the dark. Take off your glasses and try to look mean. He had his hand halfway to his face before he realized I was kidding. I wondered how the kids from town knew we were from Edgeview. It's a small place, Cheater said, as if he'd guessed my next question, so we really stick out. They know we don't go to public school. They call us alters, since we go to the alternative school. Guess what we call them? Flinch asked. I give up. What? Edgies, Flinch told me. I came up with that. I wasn't surprised. Flinch had a great gift for funny stuff. He was the one who started calling Wylan Hindenburg. You'll get used to them, Cheater told me. Hey, I'm certainly used to people treating me different. When everyone stares at you after a while, it's like nobody at all is staring. That's the truth, Flinch said. I guess they had a point, but it really felt strange the way the town kids acted. I'd wondered how they react to someone who was really dangerous like Bloodbath. He'd plow through these kids like a bulldozer through a basket of light bulbs. As we got closer to the small strip mall, I scanned the stores hoping for a pizzeria or a burger place. No luck. There was a video store at the end nearest us. I guess it closed early because the lights were off. I realized I hadn't seen a movie in weeks. Past that store, a laundry pumped the steamy smell of clothes dryers into the air. The drugstore had a sign in front that said no loitering. Behind the drugstore, jangling and flashing in that unmistakable way, stood the arcade. It was called Mondo Video. Nice surprise. It was larger than I thought it would be. I went inside expecting nothing more than a few hours of fun. But it was in the arcade, surrounded by the bright noise of mindless electronic entertainment, that I began to see the whole picture. Two edgies talking on the sidewalk a block from the arcade. Edgy 1. Oh man, it's alters. Edgy 2. Let's get out of here. Those guys will beat up anyone they get their hands on. He starts to run. Edgy 1 running. I hope they don't follow us. Edgy 2. I heard some of them carry knives. Edgy 1 panting and looking back. It's okay. They didn't follow us. Edgy 2. That was close. I hate those guys. Edgy 1. Don't worry. I heard the place is getting shut down.